Spoon and Smasher led the boys charging recklessly into the strange red and black landscape. The pounding of orc boots rang through the corridors as Snickwit tried to protest. His words were immediately drowned out by the sounds of shouts and steel-shod footfalls. The Gretchen sighed and gave up trying to manage this important discovery with any kind of care. Pumping his tiny grot legs, he managed to catch up and grip the promethium tank hanging from Spoon's burner rig and scramble onto the large orc's shoulders. Spoon was so intent on drenching the ancient technology in liquid flame that he didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care about Snickwit's presence. As the mob did its best to trash and loot everything they could get their hands on, the boys began to fan out, grabbing the most promising-looking loot. A shooter boy by the name of Grunk made his way to one of the red-lit corridors and saw what seemed like a likely pile of scrap. As he approached, the silhouette took shape, and he saw that this scrap pile looked more like a metal Humy sitting in fetal position along the wall. The alarm lights flashed again and illuminated in rows running down along the hall. Grunk could see the metal men all in a line curled up with their knees to their chests. Grunk was not exactly the soul of caution, so he dropped his shooter and began trying to tear the shiny metal skull from the weird Humy, thinking it would look right flash as a trophy. As he reached to grab his rightful gubbins, a metal arm shot out, seizing the orc by the forearm. Grunk yelled in surprise as the metal man easily pried back his right arm. The mechanical man pushed itself to its feet, with Grunk tightly held in its grip, as the orc swore, punched, and kicked, trying to tear itself free with no avail. With one swift motion and a loud crack, Grunk went limp, and the man of iron unceremoniously dropped the orc to the side and began to reach for its weapon. The sound of Grunk's demise caused quite a few heads to turn. A number of confused orcs could now see the metal Humies were on their feet, seizing strange weapons from the walls and beginning to advance on orc positions at a slow, deliberate pace. The boys began shouting and shooting as Grot scurried for cover. Lines of automatic fire raked across the metal Humies, with each fat slug of metal bouncing off of whatever these things were made out of. "We need more Daka!" The Iron Men gathered into formation, maybe a dozen of them or so. Each man stood 12 feet tall with long, reaching limbs topped with mouthless skulls. 3 stood in the first rank with long halberds that crackled with arcing red energies. The rank behind opened fire as the orcs tried to consolidate into tighter mobs, to both concentrate their fire and to get enough boys to charge the lines. A lone, enthusiastic orc sprinted away from the gathering mob and charged the metal men alone. He was promptly struck in the face by one of the bolts of energy, and he dropped like a stone. As he fell, his head rolled backwards, and the other orcs could see that his face, where the bolt had struck, was drained of its healthy green color, leaving behind a dead, desiccated husk. Spoon and Smasher had drifted a little ways away just before the fight broke out, but when they heard there was a fight to be had, they began to leg it over to the scrap. Smasher could feel the pounding hydraulics in his dread as he surged forward to gain speed. Deciding that sticking behind the Stompy Dread was the wiser thing than standing in front of it, Spoon was content to allow the walking hunk of orc and metal trundle its way forward, shoving other orcs aside as it made its way to the front. When Smasher reached the front lines, most of the orcs were smart enough to clear the way, and the Dread pilot could see a nice line of shiny metal boys emerging into view, just begging to be turned to scrap. Spoon stepped out from behind the giant Dread pilot and laid down a thick layer of promethium over the steel scarecrows. Flames erupted forth, swallowing the Iron Men from view. "Do the Bernie dance, you bony metal gits!" Boys sent up a cheer, as the enemy was likely nothing but molten slag now. However, the relentless fall of metallic feet continued as the tall, skeletal shape strode forth from the fire unharmed. Spoon looked at the nozzle of his burner and scratched his head. "Huh. Looks like I gotta change me burner from melty to slicey." He twisted a dial near the end of his burner to adjust the flames to burn at a sharp point for slicing through the thickest armors. As he did so, Smasher charged through the dying flames and crashed into the halberdiers. The Death Dread plowed into the central automaton and managed to knock him to the ground before it could swing its weapon. Standing on its chest, Smasher pinned the metal man and pressed his buzzsaw to the side of his head, sending sparks shooting across the floor. Smasher was struck by the small arms fire from the Iron Men. While the metal of his dread was getting heated and starting to glow red hot, these weapons seemed to be more deadly against living things than mechanical. Without a perfect shot down his view grill, they couldn't target any organic tissue. The other boys were using the dread as cover to rush forward and close the gap and get properly stuck in. Looters were finally arriving and opening up with their def guns, sending much-needed big daka into the metal men. As Smasher cut a large gouge into the neck of the pinned automaton, the two other halberdiers moved in to engage him, swinging their blades in wide arcs, sweeping through orc flesh on their way to Smasher's hull. Smasher spun to his right and managed to catch the haft of the axe of one assailant with his claw. But with a hissing crack, the other Iron Man sliced right through Smasher's other arm. His buzzsaw fell with a loud clang, and Smasher howled in pain. Having one's nervous system rigged into a machine had its downsides. Smasher began firing his chest-mounted shooters wildly, trying to ward off the two metallic men. Snikwit began to sweat as Smasher looked like he was going to go down and be hacked to pieces.
If they smash Smasher, then these metal boys is going to roll up this mob without even a decent scrap. We's got to do something. Now listen, I's got an idea.
Spoon nodded and narrowed his eyes. He looked at the flailing dread and looked at the remaining metal boys. Then he looked back at Snikwit, who was babbling on about something and pointing at things. Before Snikwit could finish explaining, Spoon was off like a rocket, waving around his slicer like a maniac. Snikwit could only hold on for dear life.
Gork and Mork is with me! Whoa!
The burner boy tore towards the beleaguered Smasher, wielding his slicer and dodging this way and that between searing bolts of red energy. Orcs were not the most renowned of marksmen, so Spoon was also lucky to avoid the thick clouds of def gun daka that filled the air. Smasher still had one of the long axes gripped in his claws, as he pivoted and shoved the Iron Man he was gripping with up against the one who lopped off his favorite buzzy arm, using one as a shield against the other. As he drew closer, Spoon plucked Snikwit off his shoulder with his free hand. The grot panicked and flailed in the orc's grip.
Ah! Put me down! Don't you know where I am? I'm the boss's favouriteest grot! I don't want to die! Ah!
With one mighty fling, Spoon hurled Snikwit through the air at the face of the metal man who was not in a grapple with Smasher. Snikwit screeched in terror as he instinctively clawed at the eyes of the towering behemoth. It was enough to distract it long enough for Spoon to slip in, and with one sizzling slice, he cut right through the wrists of the grappled metal man, freeing the halberd from his grip. Smasher nearly stumbled backwards, his claw gripping its prize, one of the shiny red choppers that had killed so many boys. Without a moment of hesitation, Smasher began swinging wildly in a berserk fury, hacking into the disarmed Iron Man, chopping it to pieces in a mere moments. When the other managed to scrape Snikwit free from its face, flinging the obnoxious grot to the side, Smasher's blade was there to meet it, splitting the Iron Man's head straight down the middle in a shower of sparks and convulsing limbs. With all three metal men destroyed, Spoon and Smasher bellowed in victory. Whoa! The orcs surged forward, rallying to their war cry, and began to swarm the remaining men. Their weapons were deadly, but their defenders were destroyed, and more orcs were joining the fray. It was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. With choppers flashing red in the light and the muzzle flash of Luta def guns pitted against the crack of energy guns, the orcs eventually reduced the ancient guardians of this place to piles of very fancy scrap. As looters began to work on stealing everything that wasn't nailed down, at least until someone stole the nails, Spoon kicked one of the deceased machine men. He looked over it at Smasher, who was now carrying around a severed arm, trying to make sure it wasn't carried off by overzealous scrappers.
"What's the deal with these metal boys?" asked Spoon. "They don't look like them tomb boys. The tomb boys likes the green."
Smasher shrugged his shoulder. Well, maybe they wanted to go faster, so they made this lot red. Except they was going real slow. Snickwit pulled himself free from the debris as Smasher and Spoon idly wondered about the nature of the metal men. He'd seen enough. He needed to get back to Gutzmangul quickly. Who knows what could have happened to the boss in his absence? Maybe he found a new favorite grot. Snickwit cursed under his breath. If any git tried to steal his favoritist grot spot from the boss, he'd feed their guts to the squigs. And if it came back with news of this weird place, Gutzmangul would have to take him back. And who knew what Gutzmangul had in mind for this place?